Welcome to Gangster Echoes. Tonight, let your mind slow down as we take a trip back in time, across the ocean, to a small village in Sicily where one of the most powerful names in organized crime first opened his eyes. Make yourself comfortable, settle in, and let this story guide you towards sleep. Don't forget to subscribe to Gangster Echoes for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always enjoy reading where our listeners are tuning in from around the world. The year was 1897, and the small town of Lucky sat under the warm Sicilian sun. Its streets were dusty, its homes made of stone, its hills lined with olive trees and hard soil. It was here that Salvatore Lucchini was born, the boy who would one day be called Lucky Luciano, the man who would forever change the face of organized crime. Life in Lucky was not easy. The town had known poverty for generations. Men worked long hours in sulfur mines. Women kept homes running with little more than scraps. And children grew up tough, learning early that the world was not always kind. Salvatore's father, Antonio, dreamed of something better for his family, something beyond the limits of Sicily's harsh hills. He believed that the answer waited across the ocean, in America, where work was plenty and fortune could be made by those willing to chase it. In 1906, when Salvatore was just 9 years old, the family packed their few belongings and boarded a ship bound for the United States. The journey across the Atlantic was long and crowded, filled with the smell of salt and the sound of crying children. But at last, the Statue of Liberty came into view, a towering symbol of hope. Like so many before them, the Lucchini family stepped onto the shores of New York, believing they had found a new beginning. But New York was no paradise. The Lucchini family settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a place overflowing with immigrants from every corner of Europe. The streets were narrow and crowded, lined with tenement buildings that seemed to touch the sky. Crime was never far away. Gangs roamed the alleys, controlling the neighborhoods block by block. For young Salvatore, this was a new classroom, and the streets became his teachers. He went to school, but the lessons never held his attention. He was small but quick, clever but restless. The language was strange, the rules unfamiliar, and the other children often mocked him for his thick Sicilian accent. It did not take long for Salvatore to decide that school was not where he belonged. He preferred the freedom of the streets, where the gang boys laughed loudly, wore sharp clothes, and moved like they owned the city. It was there in those alleys that Salvatore began to change. He shortened his name to Charlie, blending in more with the American boys. He joined with other kids who ran errands, carried messages, and occasionally stole what they could. The money was small at first, just coins clinking in his pocket, but it was more than school could give him. Charlie was ambitious. He wanted more than just scraps. By the time he was a teenager, he was running with a 5 Points gang, one of the most feared gangs in New York. This was no longer child's play. These were men who made their living through violence, extortion, and gambling. Charlie learned quickly. He learned how to fight, how to negotiate, how to stay quiet when the police came asking questions. He also learned something else, something that would set him apart from so many others. Charlie understood that brute force alone was not enough. Power needed structure, order, and respect. He began to see crime not just as survival, but as business. During these years, Charlie also met two men who would become important parts of his story, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Meyer was a quiet, brilliant thinker with a gift for numbers. Bugsy was fearless, hot-tempered, and deadly when he needed to be. Together, the three formed a bond that would carry them to the coming years and shape the future of organized crime. The streets of New York were violent, but they were also full of opportunity for those willing to take risks. And Charlie took plenty of them. He started running bootleg liquor as soon as Prohibition hit in 1920. The city was suddenly dry by law, but thirstier than ever by desire. Bars closed, but secret drinking spots opened in their place, and Charlie saw the chance to build something bigger than he had ever dreamed of. It was during this time that the nickname Lucky began to follow him. Some said it came from the time he survived a savage beating and kidnapping by rival gangsters. They had cut him, stabbed him, and left him for dead, but Charlie lived, scars running down his face as a permanent reminder. Others said it was simply because he always seemed to escape the worst dangers, slipping away from police, surviving gang wars, and landing on his feet no matter the risk. Lucky Luciano was no longer just another gangster on the streets of New York. He was becoming a name, a figure who moved between worlds, the Italian gangs, the Jewish gangs, and the Irish gangs, with ease. He understood that cooperation meant more money than constant war. Where others saw rivals, Lucky saw partners. By his mid-20s, Luciano was ready to make his move. The old guard of the Mafia, men who still clung to the ways of Sicily, resisted change. They believed in tradition, in oaths of loyalty, in keeping power within a small circle of trusted men. Luciano respected their history, but he also saw that their way was holding back the future. And so, Lucky began to plan, carefully and quietly, the transformation that would make him not just a gangster, but the architect of the American Mafia. By the early 1920s, New York City had become a city of secret doors. Behind ordinary storefronts and quiet apartments were the speakeasies where liquor flowed like rivers. The law said no, but money said yes, and money always spoke louder. For Charlie, Lucky, Luciano, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He built a network with precision, working with bootleggers, smugglers, and corrupt officials to move alcohol through the city. His partnership with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel proved invaluable. Lansky managed a book for the mind as sharp as any accountant, making sure every dollar was counted. Bugsy made sure no one crossed them without paying the price. Together, they turned crime into business, a machine that ran with clockwork efficiency. But Luciano's rise did not go unnoticed. The Mafia in New York was divided, split between old-world bosses who still ruled with Sicilian tradition and younger men like Luciano who wanted change. At the center of the old guard was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria. He had power, soldiers, and the loyalty of many, but he lacked vision. To him, the Mafia was a personal kingdom to be ruled by fear, with loyalty demanded, not earned. Luciano swore loyalty to Masuria, but in his mind, he saw a different future. He dreamed of an organization not limited by old rivalries, one that included Italians, Jews, and even Irishmen if they could make money. To the old bosses, this idea was unthinkable. The Mafia, to them, was Sicilian and Sicilian only. As tensions grew, another powerful figure entered the picture, Salvatore Maranzano, a man who believed he could be the next great ruler of New York. He came from Sicily with ambition in his heart, and soon the city was divided between the two camps. Masuria on one side, Maranzano on the other. The streets became battlegrounds. Men were gunned down in restaurants, alleys, and even in broad daylight. The newspapers called the Castellammarese War, a bloody struggle that left bodies piling up as each side fought for control. Luciano found himself in the middle. He had sworn allegiance to Masuria, but he began to see that the old boss could not win this war. Masuria clung to the old ways, refusing to trust anyone outside his inner circle, making enemies faster than allies. Luciano, always calculating, began to wonder if staying loyal meant throwing away everything he had worked for. In April 1931, Luciano made his choice. He invited Masuria to a quiet lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. They sat together, playing cards, eating, laughing. When Luciano excused himself to use the restroom, 4 gunmen stepped into the room. They opened fire, killing Masuria on the spot. It was the end of Joe the Boss and the end of an era. With Masuria gone, Luciano turned to Maranzano. For a time, the city seemed to settle. Maranzano declared himself the boss of bosses, the one who would rule over all the mafia families in New York. He reorganized the gangs into 5 families, giving each its own territory and leadership. For a moment, it seemed like the peace Luciano had dreamed was within reach. But Maranzano soon revealed himself to be no different from the old bosses. He ruled with arrogance, demanding total obedience. He distrusted Luciano's friendships with Jewish gangsters like Lansky and Siegel. He saw Lucky not as a partner, but as a threat. And soon, Luciano learned that Maranzano had ordered his death. But if Maranzano was planning to strike first, Lucky struck faster. On a September afternoon in 1931, Luciano's men stormed Maranzano's office, posing as government agents. They disarmed his guards, then stabbed and shot Maranzano, leaving him dead on the floor. The boss of bosses was no more. With Maranzano gone, Luciano stepped into the power vacuum. But instead of taking the title for himself, he abolished it. No longer would there be one man ruling over all. Instead, Luciano formed a commission, a council made up of the heads of the 5 New York families, along with powerful bosses from Chicago and other cities. Together, they would make decisions, settle disputes, and keep the peace. This was Luciano's vision come to life. The Mafia was no longer just a Sicilian secret society. It was now an organized national network that crossed ethnic lines and stretched from coast to coast. The wars were over, for now, and business was booming. In this new order, Luciano thrived. He became the most powerful gangster in America, but he wore his power lightly. He preferred the background, letting others take the spotlight. He was not a man who posed for the newspapers like Al Capone. Instead, he moved quietly, shaking hands, making deals, keeping the machine running smoothly. Under his leadership, the Mafia grew richer than ever. Bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering. Everything flowed through the commission. Money poured in, and Luciano took his share with a steady hand. But as powerful as he had become, Lucky never forgot the streets where he started. He still walked among the people, still laughed easily, still carried himself with a charm that made friends out of enemies. To some, he was a criminal mastermind. To others, he was a man who brought peace to New York's underworld, the father of a system that ended the chaos and gave the city order. For a time, it seemed as though nothing could touch him. By the early 1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano had done something no man before him had accomplished. He had brought order to chaos. The endless gang wars that had once soaked New York in blood had quieted. The commission was in place, keeping disputes from turning into massacres. And Luciano stood at its center, not as a dictator, but as a man who balanced power with partnership. This was his golden age. Luciano moved through the city with quiet confidence. He had no need to hide, no need to boast. In sharp suits and polished shoes, he looked more like a businessman than a gangster. And in many ways, that was exactly what he had become. To him, crime was not just a way to survive. It was a business empire, one that stretched from the speakeasies of New York to the gambling dens of Chicago and beyond. The money was staggering. Bootlegging was still profitable, But Luciano's interests had expanded far past liquor. He had a hand in illegal gambling halls, union rackets, loan sharking, and even drug smuggling. Each stream of cash fed into the larger machine, and Luciano kept it all running with a steady hand. But what set Luciano apart was not just the wealth he gathered, but the way he kept peace. He believed that constant war was bad for business. Dead men could not pay, and blood on the streets drew too much attention from the police. So he used diplomacy when he could, violence when he had to, and always made sure the business came first. His friends Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel were never far from him during this period. Lansky's numbers kept the profits growing, and Bugsy's fearlessness kept rivals in line. Together, they built a network so strong that few dared challenge it. Yet, Luciano was not untouchable. The press had begun to notice him, calling him the new king of the underworld. And in the offices of law enforcement, his name was whispered as the man they most wanted to bring down. District Attorney Thomas Dewey was one of those men. Dewey had made it his mission to strike at organized crime, and Luciano was at the top of his list. But Lucky was careful. He kept a low profile, avoided public violence, and let his lieutenants do most of the work. Catching him would not be easy. Still, Luciano was not perfect. He had a weakness that would one day lead to his downfall, the vice business. Luciano controlled a massive prostitution ring that operated across New York. It was profitable, but it also left him vulnerable. Prostitutes were easier to intimidate than hardened gangsters, and when Dewey's investigators began rounding them up, some of them talked. For now, though, Lucky seemed untouchable. He dined at the best restaurants, stayed at the finest hotels, and traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he found refuge among corrupt officials who turned a blind eye to his presence. His charm opened doors, his money kept him open, and his name carried weight from coast to coast. Despite the constant threat of arrest, Luciano lived well. He loved the nightclubs, the music, the bright lights of Broadway. He was often seen with beautiful women on his arm, smiling, laughing, never looking over his shoulder. If he feared what was coming, he never showed it. But while Lucky enjoyed the good life, the world around him was beginning to change. The Great Depression had left America struggling, and people were growing tired of crime bosses living like kings while honest men starved. Politicians wanted results. They wanted to show that the law still had teeth. Dewey kept building his case, slowly tightening the noose. He spoke to witness after witness, gathering evidence piece by piece. Luciano might have been careful, but no man could keep every secret hidden forever. For now, though, Luciano remained calm. He had seen worse storms, and he believed he could weather this one too. The commission still met under his watch, the money still flowed, and New York stayed quiet. This was Lucky Luciano at his peak, the man who had turned a street gang kid into the most powerful crime figure in America. But as history would soon show, even the most carefully built empires can fall when the right man comes knocking. 1935. The quiet pressure building against Luciano had turned into a full pursuit. Thomas Dewey, now a special prosecutor, was determined to take down New York's crime syndicate. He believed that if he could bring Luciano to trial, he could send a message that no gangster, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. Luciano was not easily rattled, but he could feel the heat rising. Arrests were happening all around him. Brothel madams, pimps, street-level operators. Dewey's men worked day and night, questioning anyone connected to Luciano's vast vice network. The story began to appear in the papers, headlines shouting that the city's top mob boss was the man behind the prostitution racket. For years, Lucky had kept a careful distance from the operations. He did not handle money directly, did not write orders that could be traced back to him. But Dewey's case was built on testimony, on a string of witnesses who told the same story again and again. They said Luciano was the man at the top, the man who took a cut from every dollar made, the man who made the whole thing run. In April 1936, Dewey made his move. Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had been relaxing as if nothing in the world could touch him. But when the law came knocking, there was nowhere to hide. Luciano was taken back to New York under heavy guard, the press swarming every step of the way. The trial that followed was front-page news. Day after day, the courtroom filled with reporters, spectators, and police. The women who had once worked for Luciano's network took the stand, describing in detail how the operation worked, how payments flowed up the chain, how fear kept them silent until Dewey's men gave them a way out. Luciano sat calmly through it all, dressed sharply, his dark eyes betraying little emotion. But inside, he must have known what was coming. The jury deliberated only a short time before returning with their verdict. Guilty on 62 counts. The sentence shocked even Luciano. He was given a prison term of 30 to 50 years. Effectively a life sentence for a man who had believed himself untouchable. The king of the underworld was led away in handcuffs, no longer free to walk the streets he once ruled. Luciano was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a grim, isolated prison near the Canadian border. The place was known as Little Siberia for its cold, harsh winters. Here, Lucky traded his fine suits for prison denim, his hotel suites for a small, narrow cell. At first, he struggled with the loss of freedom. But Luciano was nothing if not adaptable. He began to adjust, earning respect even behind bars. He worked in the prison laundry, read books, kept himself in shape. Guards later said he was polite, even charming, never causing trouble. Still, prison could not erase who he was. Luciano remained a man of influence. Messages flowed in and out of the prison walls. Orders given keep the machine of the mafia running. Even locked away, Lucky was still Lucky. But outside, the world was changing. Prohibition was long gone. The underworld was shifting, new men rising to fill the gaps left by those who had fallen. Luciano's absence created room for others to gain power. The mafia did not collapse without him. It adapted, just as he had taught it to. And then came the war. In 1942, the United States had entered World War II, and the government found itself in need of allies, even unlikely ones. New York's docks were critical to the war effort, but they were vulnerable to sabotage. Fires had already broken out under mysterious circumstances, and rumors swirled that enemy agents might be working along the waterfront. The Office of Naval Intelligence decided it needed someone who could control the docks, someone who could make sure there would be no more sabotage. There was only one man who could make that happen, Charles Lucky Luciano. Through secret negotiations, the government struck a deal with the imprisoned Gangster. In exchange for his help securing the docks and providing intelligence through his contacts in Sicily, Luciano's sentence would be commuted. When news of the deal eventually reached the public, it was met with outrage in some circles. How could the government work with a man like Luciano? But others argued that it had saved lives, protected supplies, and helped the war effort. Whatever the truth, the deal was made, and in 1946, after serving nearly 10 years, Lucky Luciano walked out of prison a free man. But freedom came with a price. As part of the deal, Luciano was deported to Italy. He would never again set foot in the country. He had made his empire. When Lucky Luciano's ship docked in Naples in 1946, the man who had once ruled New York stepped onto foreign soil with mixed emotions. He was free, yes, but he was also banished. America, the land that shaped him, the city streets that had built him, were now closed in forever. Naples was alive with noise, rebuilding from the war, its streets buzzing with black market trade. Luciano quickly found his footing. Though far from the alleys of the Lower East Side, he was still a man of connections, and soon he was in touch with old friends and new allies. Some greeted him as a hero, the man who had once been the king of the American underworld. Others approached him carefully, wondering what role he would now play in this new chapter. Luciano rented a suite at the Excelsior Hotel, a beautiful building overlooking the Bay of Naples. He dressed as sharply as ever, carried himself with dignity, and was often seen in cafes, drinking espresso, speaking with visitors from America. But behind the calm surface, Luciano was busy. He began to organize meetings, bringing together Sicilian mafia bosses and emissaries from the United States. Some say it was here that Luciano began helping rebuild the heroin trade, setting up networks that moved drugs from Italy to America. Others argue that Luciano had grown tired of the business and only sought to mediate disputes, to keep the peace among the families he had once united. The truth, as with much of his life, is difficult to pin down. Still, Luciano's presence in Italy did not go unnoticed. The Italian police kept close watch on him, raiding his hotel room more than once, seizing letters and questioning his visitors. They feared that he would become a new power in the post-war underworld, a man who could turn Sicily into the center of a global crime empire. Luciano took these intrusions calmly, but inside he must have felt the weight of exile pressing down. He could not walk the streets of New York. He could not see his old haunts, his favorite clubs, the skyline that had been his kingdom. From time to time, he would receive letters from friends back in America, and the nostalgia must have been sharp. Despite the distance, Luciano's influence still reached across the ocean. The commission in New York continued to run its business, and though Lucky was no longer officially in charge, many of the bosses still sought his advice. His words still carried weight. He was no longer a king, but he remained a kingmaker. But Luciano's life in Italy was not all business. He enjoyed the good things whenever he could, fine meals, music, and company. He was often seen walking along the waterfront, nodding to those who recognized him. To the younger generation, he was a living legend, the man who had once tamed New York. Yet, not everyone admired him. Law enforcement, both Italian and American, continued to keep him under pressure. The U.S. government made sure he would never return, denying every appeal to lift his deportation order. To them, he was still a dangerous figure, no matter how far away he lived. In 1947, Luciano moved to Rome, hoping for more privacy. The Eternal City offered new faces and fresh surroundings, but the scrutiny never truly faded. Wherever he went, police followed, journalists wrote, rumors swirled. Still, Luciano kept working in the shadows. In 1957, he reportedly helped organize the infamous meeting at the Grand Hotel de Palms in Palermo, where American and Sicilian mob leaders discussed the future of the drug trade. Whether Luciano was a mastermind or simply a respected elder statesman offering advice, no one can say for sure. For Lucky, these years were both a second act and a slow fading. He remained respected, even feared, but he was no longer the man in the center of the storm. The world was changing. New gangsters were rising, new battles being fought. Luciano had once shaped the underworld to his vision, but now he could only watch from afar as others carried the torch. Still, there was a kind of peace in this stage of his life. He had survived the wars, the betrayals, the prison years. He had seen his empire rise and fall, and still lived to tell the tale. In a world where so many of his friends and enemies died young, Luciano had outlasted them all, and yet he could never escape the feeling that part of him had been left behind in America, on the streets of New York, in the speakeasies and smoky backrooms where it had all begun. By the mid-1950s, Lucky Luciano was no longer the young, ambitious gangster who had once transformed New York. His hair had grayed, his face showed the weight of years, but his mind remained sharp. He still kept a watchful eye on the underworld, still stayed in contact with the men who now ran the commission, and still believed he had a part to play. In 1946, shortly after his release from prison, Luciano had arranged what became known as the Havana Conference. He traveled under secret arrangements to Cuba, hoping to reestablish himself as a key figure in the American Mafia. Havana, with its glittering nightclubs, casinos, and warm breezes, was a perfect meeting place for bosses from across the United States. At the Hotel Nacional, Luciano sat at the head of the table as powerful men arrived one by one. There was Vito Genovese, his one-time lieutenant, now eager to expand his own power. Frank Costello, the quiet diplomat of the underworld, was there too, as was Albert Anastasia, the feared Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated. Even Meyer Lansky, ever the loyal friend, stood by Lucky's side. The purpose of the meeting was simple: to discuss the future of organized crime and decide who would control what in the post-war era. Gambling operations were booming, narcotics were becoming more profitable, and everyone wanted their share. Luciano used a meeting to remind them all that he was still a man of influence, still capable of guiding the Commission's decisions even from exile. But Luciano's return to power was short-lived. Word of his presence in Cuba reached Washington, and the U.S. government pressured the Cuban authorities to expel him. Within months, Luciano was forced back to Italy, his dreams of reestablishing himself in the Americas shattered. Even in Italy, however, Luciano's name continued to surface in connection with the growing heroin trade. Routes were being set up from Turkey and the Middle East, through Italy, and into the United States. The drug trade was dangerous business, bringing enormous profits but also enormous risk. Luciano's role is still debated today. Some claim he was the architect of the pipeline. Others say he only gave advice, warning younger men not to draw too much attention. By the late 1950s, Luciano's health had begun to decline. Years of stress, prison, and constant surveillance had taken their toll. He suffered from heart problems, and though he still dressed elegantly and carried himself with dignity, his steps had grown slower, his movements more careful. Despite this, he continued to receive visitors, both friends and strangers. Some came to pay respect to the man who had once ruled New York. Others came seeking counsel or blessing for their own ventures. Luciano would sit in his apartment or a quiet cafe, listening, speaking softly, giving advice in his measured way. To many younger gangsters, Luciano was more than a man. He was living history. He was the one who had created the Commission, the one who had turned gangs into an organization. His words carried the weight of decades, and though he was far from the streets where he had built his empire, his influence still stretched across the ocean. But there was also a sense of loneliness that hung over him in those years. Most of his closest friends were gone or far away. Meyer Lansky still visited when he could, but Bugsy Siegel had been killed years earlier in a hail of bullets. Many of Luciano's old allies had been murdered, imprisoned, or replaced by a younger generation who knew him only as a legend. In private moments, Luciano reportedly reflected on his life with a kind of quiet pride. He had brought peace to Mafia, ended the senseless wars, and built a system that endured even without him. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had survived when so many others had not. And perhaps that survival was his greatest victory. For a man who had lived through kidnappings, assassination attempts, and betrayal, to sit in the sun of Naples in his later years was a triumph in itself. Still, fate was not finished with Lucky Luciano. In early 1962, he received word that an American film producer wanted to make a movie about his life. Luciano was intrigued. Perhaps he thought this was his chance to finally tell a story his own way, to show the world the man behind the myth. On January 26, 1962, Luciano dressed sharply as always and went to meet the producer at the Naples airport. He was excited, even smiling as he waited. But before the meeting could take place, Luciano collapsed, struck by a massive heart attack. Within minutes, the father of the American Mafia was gone. When Lucky Luciano collapsed that January day in Naples, the news traveled quickly. Within hours, headlines across Italy and America carried the story. The man once called the father of the American Mafia was dead at 64. For some, it was just another gangster gone, another name from a bloody era now buried in the past. But for others, it was the passing of a legend. Luciano's body lay in Naples for several days as arrangements were made. Friends came to pay their respects, some traveling from far corners of the world. The Italian police, who had kept him under watch for years, stood outside quietly, as if even they understood this was a moment larger than themselves. At first, it seemed that Luciano would remain in Italy forever, but his family fought to have his body returned to the United States. Surprisingly, the American government allowed it. For the first time since his deportation, Lucky Luciano came home. His casket was brought to New York, the city where his story had begun. The funeral was held at St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the resting place of many who had lived and died in the underworld. Hundreds of mourners attended, from well-dressed gangsters to curious reporters. The air was heavy that day, not just with grief, but with respect. Some stood in silence, remembering the man who had brought peace to the Mafia. Others whispered about his crimes, the lives he had taken, the empire he had built from blood and bootleg whiskey. Still, there was no denying that they were witnessing the burial of a man who had shaped an entire chapter of American history. The casket was lowered into the ground, and with it went the last physical trace of the boy from Sicily who had come to America with nothing and carved out a place in the world with his own hands. Luciano was gone, but even in death, his story refused to rest. In the days that followed, newspapers published long stories about his life. His childhood in Sicily, his rise on the streets of New York, his betrayal of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, his creation to commission his fall, and his years in exile. Some articles painted him as a criminal mastermind, a ruthless killer who got what he deserved. Others called him a visionary, a man who brought order to chaos, who turned gang wars into business and gave structure to an empire. It seemed everyone had a different version of Lucky Luciano, and in some way, all of them were true. Hollywood wasted no time drawing inspiration from his life. Films, television shows, and novels borrowed pieces of his story, turning him into a character who could be feared, admired, or both. The scar on his face, the fedora, the calm smile, all became symbols of the gangster era. In the years after his death, Luciano's legend only grew. His name was spoken with reverence in some circles, with disgust in others, but it was always spoken. He became a symbol not just of organized crime, but of ambition, of cunning, of what it meant to seize control of one's destiny. Even outside the law, historians continue to debate his true legacy. Some argued that he was the first modern gangster, the man who turned the mafia into an organized, almost corporate network. Others pointed out the blood on his hands, the violence that had made his rise possible. But even those who hated what he stood for admitted that he had changed the underworld forever. For the men who came after him, Luciano's life was a blueprint. He showed that power was not just about guns, but about structure, about diplomacy, about knowing when to fight and when to make peace. The commission he built outlived him, continuing to govern the mafia for decades. But Luciano's story was not just about crime. It was about the immigrant experience, about a boy from Sicily who came to America with nothing and carved out a place for himself in a city that did not welcome him easily. It was about the choices a man makes when faced with poverty and hardship, about the price of power, about the cost of survival. As the years passed, Luciano became less of a man and more of a myth. His name appeared in books, documentaries, and songs. Young gangsters invoked him as inspiration, while law enforcement studied his methods to understand how to dismantle the systems he had built. And perhaps that was Luciano's final victory, that even in death, he remained relevant. His story still told, his influence still felt. As the years moved on from Luciano's death, something interesting began to happen. The man who had once been hunted by police and prosecutors became the subject of fascination. People wanted to understand him, to study him, to tell his story. He was no longer just a criminal figure. He had become part of American folklore. Hollywood loved Luciano. Gangster films have been popular since the 1930s, but now they had a real-life model to draw from. Movies like The Valachi Papers and Lucky Luciano put his name on the big screen, portray him as everything from a ruthless mastermind to a man of vision. Actors played him with sharp suits and cool expressions, turning him into a symbol of charm mixed with danger. Television, too, borrowed from his story. Crime shows used characters based on Luciano, and documentaries explored every detail of his life. The image of the calm, calculating gangster who preferred diplomacy over chaos became a permanent part of how the mafia was imagined. Even music carried his name. Jazz musicians reference him, and decades later, rappers would use his story as a metaphor for power, ambition, and surviving the odds. To many in the world of hip-hop, Lucky Luciano was more than a mobster. He was proof that someone from the bottom could climb to the very top, no matter the rules they had to break. Writers and historians dug into the archives, publishing books about his life, his deals, his betrayals. They debated whether he really had as much power as the legend suggested, whether he was as responsible for the heroin trade as some claimed, whether he was a hero to the mafia or simply another man who took what he could. Each new book seemed to add another layer, another perspective, to a life already full of contradictions. But it wasn't just entertainment or scholarship that kept his memory alive. Luciano's story spoke to something deeper in the human imagination. He was a man who had changed the game, who had turned a disorganized, bloody world into a structured empire. He was proof that order could come from chaos, that even criminals could follow rules if they were the right ones. And perhaps that is why people remain fascinated. Because Luciano was not just a gangster, he was a builder. He built something that outlasted him, something that, for better or worse, became part of the fabric of American history. Tourists still visit St. John's Cemetery in Queens, standing quietly by his grave. They take photos, leave flowers, and wonder what it must have been like to live in his time. They walk through the streets of Manhattan's Lower East Side, looking at the tenements where he once played as a boy, imagining how the future king of the underworld first learned to fight, to hustle, to dream. There is also something cinematic about the arc of Luciano's life. It had everything: poverty, ambition, betrayal, triumph, downfall, redemption, and exile. He was a boy who crossed an ocean, a man who built an empire, a prisoner who struck a deal with the government, and finally, an exile who died far from home. It is the kind of story that feels like it was meant to be told. In many ways, Luciano set the template for every gangster story that came after, from the characters in The Godfather to Tony Soprano. Traces of Lucky Luciano can be seen: his calm leadership, his belief in family and loyalty, his vision of crime as an organization rather than chaos. And yet, despite the romanticism that often surrounds a story, Luciano's life was still marked by blood. People died for him, died because of him, died in the wars that paved the way for his rise. He lived by a code, but it was a code written in violence. That truth is part why his story continues to resonate, because it forces us to ask whether power built on such a foundation can ever truly be admired. Still, the fascination remains. Nearly a century after his rise, his name still carries weight. He is remembered not just as a criminal, but as a visionary who changed the course of organized crime forever. The shadow of Lucky Luciano stretched far beyond his grave. The commission he built endured for decades after his death, guiding the American Mafia through times of prosperity and crisis. It settled disputes, divided territories, and made decisions that shaped the underworld. Luciano's vision of a structured, business-like organization had become reality, but his legacy was not only felt in the mob's success. Law enforcement used his story as a warning, a case study in how organized crime could grow if left unchecked. Police academies studied his methods. Prosecutors learned from Dewey's case against him, and federal agencies expanded their reach to make sure another Luciano could never rise so easily again. Luciano's ghost seemed to linger in New York. The bars and streets he once walked became the subject of tours and books. The apartments where he had plotted became points on a map for curious visitors. Even in death, he was still a presence, a name spoken in hushed tones. But Luciano's story also became a kind of mirror. It asked people to consider what power really costs, what ambition can take from a man. Yes, he had built an empire, but he had also spent years in a cell, and he had died far from the city he loved. He had everything, and in some ways he had nothing. To some, Luciano is remembered as a genius of organization, a man who turned crime into a business model. To others, he is remembered as a ruthless figure whose empire was soaked in blood. Both are true, and that complexity is why his story continues to be told. Tonight, as you listen to the final moments of Lucky Luciano's story, picture him not as a figure from history books, but as a man, a boy from a poor Sicilian village who crossed the ocean, survived the streets, made friends who follow him anywhere, and built something that had never existed before. Picture him in his prime, walking through the city in a tailored suit, a cigarette between his fingers, knowing that every deal, every handshake, every quiet nod meant something. And then picture him years later, an older man sitting on a balcony in Naples, looking out at the bay, remembering the city he could no longer touch. He had seen it all: wars, betrayals, victories, prison bars, and he lived long enough to watch his legend take shape while he was still alive. Luciano's story is not just about crime. It is about transformation. He transformed himself, his world, and the very meaning of the word mafia. He left behind an empire that would shape America for decades. And whether we see him as villain or visionary, we cannot deny that his life changed history. So as you let the story fade into the quiet of the night, remember that power always comes with a price. Lucky Luciano paid his in scars, in prison years, in exile. And yet, even now, nearly a century later, we still speak his name. Here on Gangster Echoes, we tell these stories so you can feel the past breathe again, so you can drift into sleep hearing the voices of history. If you enjoyed the story of Lucky Luciano, subscribe to Gangster Echoes for more nights like this. And before you close your eyes, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Close your eyes now and let the story settle. The father of the American Mafia has walked off into history, but his echo will always remain.